Following the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, some Jews fled to the west seeking safety in Egypt and taking refuge on a tiny island in the Upper Nile region. Measuring just a kilometer in length and only about a third as wide, Elephantine housed a thriving Jewish community that had existed for several centuries and was even home to its own temple built to the same specifications found in the Old Testament for Solomon's temple. They communicated regularly with Jerusalem until that city was destroyed, and there seemed to be no issue with the fact that the Jews in Elephantine maintained that Yahweh had a wife named Anat, a detail that has led some to conclude that polytheism survived even in Jerusalem much longer than previously thought. But the most surprising feature might be what these Jews did not include in their writings. The founder of their culture, the patriarch Abraham, was seemingly unknown to them, as was his descendants Isaac, Jacob, and even Joseph, who led the Israelites into Egypt. Worse still, these Egyptian Jews didn't even know the story of Moses, a man born in their own land, or the tale of how he brought the nation out of bondage. It's as if these legends, which were so intrinsically linked with the Jews of the Second Temple period, didn't even exist until after Cyrus freed them from Babylon. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Isaiah 40-55, called Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah, seems to have been written shortly after the end of the Babylonian exile and depicts Yahweh's promise to the Jewish people to redeem them and place them in their own land. The text clearly mentions the release from captivity and journey to Zion, but not much after that, indicating it was likely written in that time period. Books like Ezra and Nehemiah discuss events which happened generations after the return, but the events in Deutero-Isaiah end when the refugees become residents of Zion. In the previous 39 chapters, the focus was upon Yahweh's judgment, both on the nation of Israel and on foreign powers. Here, Yahweh demonstrates a softer touch, treating his chosen people with kindness in looking to a time of liberation, peace, and prosperity. The primary concern with this text is the salvation of the exiles and promise of protection from their patron God. We can divide the text into three sections. The first is chapters 40-48, which serves as a prologue and promises deliverance and comfort to the people and their return to Zion. The second section, 49-55, concerns the response of the Jewish community to follow their prophet. The third section, which was added sometime later, is called the Servant Songs. 4 songs, or fragments of songs, concerning a mysterious figure that we shall call the Suffering Servant. These are the first 4 verses of chapter 42, the first 6 verses of chapter 49, verses 4 through 9 of chapter 50, and chapter 52, verse 13 to 53:12. Deutero-Isaiah also provides context for 3 other developments in Judaism. The servant songs provide material for the later development of the Christ story, and the Return to Zion material could provide inspiration for the stories of Abraham and Moses. To be clear, I'm not stating that the stories of Abraham and Moses were derived from Deutero-Isaiah, only that the kernel of those stories, with some interesting details, can be found here, and that, given the late dating of those other narratives, this portion of Isaiah describes events and themes which will also be used in the stories of Genesis and Exodus. One final point to cover before continuing is that this section may very well not have been written as a prophetic work of Isaiah. Of course, it wasn't written by the author of the original 39 chapters, as this section comes nearly a century later, but this section is not only anonymous, but it lacks even a single mention of the name Isaiah. It's possible this work floated around with another name or was completely anonymous until it was appended to the core of the book of Isaiah at some later date. With all of that out of the way, let's jump into the return to Zion, beginning with chapter 40. The first 11 verses are a sort of prologue for Deutero-Isaiah, offering assurance to the people that Yahweh will bless them. Despite some people arguing that this section of Isaiah was written prior to Cyrus's release of the exiles, the opening verses are an address to Jerusalem, as if the audience is presumed to be in that city. It reads more like a victory hymn than one of promise, but that's just my opinion. Yahweh commands his messenger, whomever that might be, to bring comfort to his people, for their time in servitude has ended. This may be directed at Isaiah, some anonymous prophet, one of the many leaders of the return that we encountered in the Ezra and Nehemiah episodes, or a command to Cyrus of Persia. He calls for his messenger to prepare the way for his people as they journey through the wilderness, and as Yahweh will be leading them, they're to prepare the way for him as well. The way will be made even, with valleys raised up and mountains brought low. A straight highway will traverse the wasteland, and the rough country will be made smooth. This language of raising the low and bringing down the lofty has been seen elsewhere. In some instances, it's used as a reversal of fates, with the mighty being cast down while the poor are elevated. It appears in 1 Isaiah, Enoch, the New Testament, and in the writings of Zoroastrianism. Here it has a double meaning. The mighty of Babylon are cast down and have lost their nation, while the slaves are being set free and given a nation of their own. It's also a promise of easy travels into their new lives. The Persians were not only sending the former slaves to Jerusalem, but financing the construction of their new temple. The people are to shout the good news from the mountaintops, specifically the holy mountain in Jerusalem, and declare before all the world that Yahweh comes in power to rule like a good shepherd, gathering in his flock. The theme of the sons of El ruling the nations like shepherds has been seen before. Verses 6 to 8 speak of the renewed fertility of the nation and Yahweh's assurance that this will endure forever. And just as this section of Isaiah begins with such a promise, it'll end this way in chapter 55, with a reminder that the nation of Israel will see an enduring fertility. We also need to examine this chapter as being similar to Isaiah 6, in which the prophet is being called by Yahweh. We have several voices speaking to the author. God speaks in verse 1 when he commands this person to bring comfort to his people. An anonymous voice speaks out in verse 3 concerning preparations to be made for Yahweh. And finally, in verse 6, another anonymous voice speaks to the prophet concerning what they should proclaim. It goes on to announce the coming fertility and Yahweh's role in the change. So we have two divine speakers addressing our author after the words of Yahweh are spoken. Since the time of the Deuteronomistic reforms, the religion of Jerusalem only had room for one deity, so this appears to be an artifact of the older belief system. And these two voices may be the two heavenly creatures that flank the throne in Isaiah's earlier vision. See episode 81. Also, this scene of a voice crying in the wilderness for the people to prepare the way for the Lord will be used again in Mark 1:3, concerning the beginning of the tale of Jesus. It's also important to note that these voices are disembodied. The God of Israel is no longer seen, choosing instead to speak from within some shelter, such as fire, smoke, a mountaintop, or the clouds. This idea can be seen in the account of Mount Sinai in Deuteronomy 4:10-12, where Yahweh hid within the smoke and fire. In verse 12, the chapter switches gears, concerning itself with the validity of Yahweh and the uselessness of idols. Yahweh alone has measured out the waters and the heavens, created the earth and the mountains and the hills. In previous text, we saw scenes where the Creator was aided through the wisdom of a wise goddess at the time of creation. But here the author denies this by rhetorically asking who had given Yahweh counsel for him to gain their knowledge. Return to episode 77 to learn more about this female co-creator in the ancient religion of Jerusalem. Here in chapter 40, the theme is monotheism, so there's no place for any such consort. Yahweh alone is their God. beyond compare to foreign deities or idols of Yahweh, which were mere objects crafted by the hands of men. He is enthroned above the firmament, vastly superior to the rulers of other nations. Chapter 41 switches settings to the heavenly court, similar to what we saw in the early chapters of Job. Yahweh calls for the coastlands to be silent before him, though this translation isn't the best choice. In Isaiah 13 and 34, they're said to haunt the ruins. Yahweh commands their silence so the nations can grow strong again. It's been argued that the word being translated as coastlands would be better understood to mean gods of the earth, as in Zephaniah 2:11. These lesser deities which ruled other nations were often the enemies of Yahweh, and here in verse 5, these enemies fear his judgment and tremble. This is reminiscent of Baal contending with the devouring desert demons who threatened the fertility he brought to the land. The Canaanites performed autumn festivals to celebrate Baal being rescued from these beings. Considering the judgment of Yahweh comes during the autumn festival, as we see in Deuteronomy 32:43, we may be seeing an evolution of the old Canaanite religion into the new Jewish celebration here. Yahweh has brought Cyrus as his champion of justice to deliver Israel and subdue kings, and brought the people from the ends of the earth to this place, indicating this was written by someone already in Jerusalem. He will bring victory to them and disgrace any who stand against them so that none will show anger towards Israel. Yahweh uses wind and storms to scatter them, once again linking the deity with his ancient role as a storm god. Rain and fertility would be brought to the land, demonstrating his power over his enemies. Yahweh has summoned champions to trample the rulers who stand against him. He challenges those other gods to foretell the future, as he has done, and proves himself to be true. But these idols are unable to do so, proving them to be nothing more than an empty wind. In chapter 42, we'll be skipping the first 4 verses for now, as they're later additions, so we'll come back to them near the end of the episode when we discuss the servant songs. We pick up the thread in 42:5 with Yahweh, again introduced as the God who created the heavens and the earth, speaking out. He has called his audience forth for justice and to bring out the prisoners from confinement. These 2 details, identifying the listener as the one Yahweh has put in charge of justice and delivering his chosen people from servitude, hints that this section of Isaiah is understood to be told from the point of view of Cyrus, not Isaiah. Yahweh has formed him and appointed him as an eternal covenant to the people. Now, you might be a bit skeptical of the idea of Yahweh appointing a foreign ruler who doesn't even acknowledge the deity as his chosen one over Israel, but we'll see a bit later that doubt is unfounded, as Cyrus isn't just Yahweh's appointed, but his anointed one. This is also a clear view of the new monotheism that will come to define the Second Temple period. Yahweh alone is God over the earth and the light to all the nations. And the titles bestowed here on Yahweh were previously those of El Elyon, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. What we're seeing is a merging of the 2 deities into a monolithic figure. No longer is Yahweh a lesser god or a great angel as he was in the past. Now he is the only God, and all of creation is subservient to him. His brothers have been reduced to empty idols. In verse 10, we discover his purpose for Israel presented in the form of a hymn similar to Psalms 96, 98, and 149. Yahweh is to be praised in a new song, which is sung all across the earth, as he goes forth like a warrior, sending out his battle cry against his enemies. Yahweh was an ancient warrior god, as is clearly stated in Exodus 15:3. The Lord is a warrior, and Yahweh is his name. And in Isaiah 42:14, this emerging warrior cries out after having remained silent, giving his battle cry. I discussed the possibility in the Psalms episodes that the word Yahweh may have originally been an ancient battle cry. I suggest going back to episode 76 to learn more about that concept. He threatens to destroy the mountains and dry up rivers and marshes. This idea that Yahweh will dry up the rivers as part of his return, specifically the rivers of Babylon, will give birth to several prophecies which have been referenced every time the water level in the Euphrates drops by any significant amount, as it has been doing for thousands of years. He then speaks of restoring sight to the blind and the hearing to the deaf, miracles which will later be attributed to Jesus. And we get a repeat of the idea that the people see but do not observe, have ears but do not hear. This too will appear in the story of Jesus. The other gods are the blind and the deaf, false and discredited gods who cannot see nor hear, defeated beings that are inferior to the enthroned Yahweh. This is similar to 1 Enoch 62, in which the defeated heavenly powers must recognize the authority of the Son of Man. In the final verses, we learn that these false gods failed to see and hear as it is shown to us. Yahweh's chosen people were taken away as plunder and thrown into prisons. This happened because they sinned against Yahweh, the God of Israel, and refused to walk in his ways. So he poured out his wrath upon them, but they didn't recognize it. Essentially, the people believed they had been conquered by the power of other gods, but in reality it was the wrath of their own. Calamity was no longer the result of divine conflict, but the punishment from a singular God. This idea will be stated more explicitly in Isaiah 45:7. The setting for chapter 43 seems to be the Day of Atonement, and deals with Yahweh's promise to both redeem and restore Israel, as is demonstrated in the very first verse, in which he tells the nation that he has indeed redeemed it, and claimed the nation as his own. He promises that they shall pass through rivers without being swept away. This theme of redemption, release from foreign oppression, and safe passage through waters may have served as inspiration for the Exodus story. Those who were cast out can be gathered in again as Yahweh atones for them. The text imagines that Yahweh gave Egypt and Ethiopia to Cyrus in exchange for Israel's freedom, as part of purchase. In reality, Cyrus owned Israel as it belonged to Babylon, which he conquered. We move into a trial scene in verse 8 in which the gods of other nations are accused of being false. Yahweh challenges them to produce witnesses to prove themselves. As occurs several times in this section of Isaiah, the challenge is issued for these other gods to demonstrate their validity by foretelling these current events. Since they hadn't spoken of them in the past, they must not be true gods. In verse 11, Yahweh declares that there are no gods before him, and it is he who saved the Israelites. This will later become the first commandment and another inspiration for the Exodus story. And another link occurs in verse 16 when Yahweh, speaking of their deliverance from bondage, declares that he will open the way in the sea by creating a path through it, and he shall snuff out a great army of chariots. This scene, which recalls Cyrus's victory over Babylon and links it with Yahweh's victory over the waters, could also serve as inspiration for the Red Sea crossing and destruction of Pharaoh's army in Exodus. Coupled with the pronouncement of the first commandment and the promise from Yahweh just a few verses later that he will provide water in the wilderness, see verse 20, and you have the bones of the book of Exodus right here in Isaiah chapter 43. Beginning in verse 22 is an interesting bit where Yahweh recounts the circumstances that led to Israel's destruction. Israel had grown weary of Yahweh and didn't offer proper sacrifices. Instead, they treated Yahweh as a servant and burdened him with their sins. Here is a clear reference to Yahweh as the servant who carries the sins of the nation for their atonement. Because they rebelled against him, he allowed their sins to destroy them. Here we see Yahweh taking up the role as the bearer of sins, which will be used heavily by the Messianic Jews a few centuries later. The first 5 verses of chapter 44 contain an oracle of salvation similar to those found in the first section of Isaiah. Yahweh is speaking to an unknown individual whom he refers to as servant and chosen, who represents Israel. He states that he will pour out his Spirit upon their descendants like water on the ground to renew their fertility, causing them to sprout like grass. And the people will write on their hands that they belong to Yahweh. This writing of the name of their owner on their hands is a reference to the practice of slave owners tattooing their names on the hands of their slaves. The name of Yahweh was also worn on the foreheads of the high priests. A diagonal cross was also worn on the foreheads of some early Christians as a sign for the holy name of Yahweh. These 5 verses almost read like an interruption when we read verses 6 through 8, which seem to continue the thread of the previous chapter concerning the Atonement Festival and Yahweh as the nation's king. Yahweh, the King of Israel, again declares that he is the only God and there is no God before him, and again he rhetorically asks who else could announce future events. He goes on to claim that he had foretold all of this to the people long ago. He also calls himself the first and the last, a title we'll see again with regard to the Christian Messiah in Revelation 1:17, where he likewise says, "Do not be afraid," just as we find here in Isaiah 44. The text goes on to declare that those who follow idols are blind and their worship leads to nothing because their idols are useless. Simple works of human hands. This is to differentiate Yahweh, who has no physical appearance at this time. The final verses of this chapter switch gears, changing subject to discuss Cyrus. Yahweh the Redeemer, who made all things and made fools of diviners and speakers of tongues, commands Jerusalem to be inhabited and the ruins of Judah to be rebuilt. He dries up the rivers and names Cyrus his shepherd to carry out his wishes, including the laying of the foundations of Jerusalem. So Yahweh identifies Cyrus as his servant and shepherd of his people, and in the first verses of chapter 45, he names Cyrus the Messiah. All 3 of these titles will later be used for Jesus, and some scholars have argued that this is an anomaly, as the Jews never linked the servant and the Messiah. Yet Cyrus carries both servant and Messiah titles along with that of the shepherd of Judah. And like Cyrus, Jesus will also arrive to build a new temple. Chapter 45 begins with Yahweh addressing the Persian Emperor Cyrus as his anointed, or Messiah. He is being sent forth to rule over the nations and subdue them, and Yahweh promises to aid in this conquest, much as he promised to do the same for Joshua. The treasures of the conquered kings will be given to him to demonstrate that Yahweh is the true God of Israel. In verse 4, it's even acknowledged that Cyrus doesn't worship Yahweh, nor even know who the deity is, though naming a foreigner as the Messiah obviously would have caused dissent among the Israelites, as verses 9 to 13 clearly addresses. Rejecting Cyrus as their Messiah is tantamount to rejecting Yahweh, and Yahweh will visit his wrath upon them, just as he sent Cyrus to exact his wrath upon Babylon. In verses 5 to 7, Yahweh explains his role, beginning with his characteristic pronouncement that he is their only God, and that they shall have none before him, as we've come to expect. He is the only God from the rising sun to its setting, meaning he's the only God across the whole earth, and there are no other gods like him. He ends this pronouncement by stating that he forms the light and creates darkness. He makes peace and creates evil, a clear indication that all things are the product of Yahweh. This is an uncomfortable problem for monotheism that will later be solved in the same manner the Zoroastrians used to solve their problem, with the incorporation of a cosmic villain. But here, all things good and evil come from a solitary figure. Yahweh is sending Cyrus to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and will be paid for his trouble by gaining other territories to add to his empire. So the Anointed One is rewarded with a land deal as part of his covenant with Yahweh. He condemns idolaters who will be put to shame, unlike the Israelites who shall never again know shame or defeat in any future age. I believe we can write this one up as a failed prophecy. Yahweh invites these wicked people to acknowledge him so they might be saved just as the Israelites will be glorified despite their troubled past. Chapter 46 concerns the gods of Babylon and begins by stating the gods Bel and Nebo, also called Nabu, will bow down to Yahweh and their idols must be carried around as a burden to their followers, rather than possessing the ability to help those who worship them. Bel is a word that means Lord, and here signifies Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, and Nebo is one of his sons who was associated with writing and agriculture. We'll discuss Bel a bit more when we cover the book of Daniel and the curious edition called Bel and the Dragon, which probably is not in your Bible. The gods are carried by the people of Babylon, who themselves go into exile. This is perhaps based on a scene in which the Babylonian temple was looted or was wishful thinking, a scene of hoped for comeuppance for the looting of the Jerusalem temple by the Babylonians. And just as the captured Babylonians are forced to carry their false gods from their temples, Yahweh offers to carry his chosen people as he takes them to safety. After contrasting these two scenes, Yahweh asks how he can be compared to these idols who deliver none from distress. And of course, he commands that they remember that he is their God, and there is none other like him. In chapter 47, Babylon is personified as a proud mistress of the nations, called the daughter of the Chaldeans, who goes down into darkness after being dethroned. Her legs are stripped bare, exposing her nakedness for the crime of refusing to show mercy to Yahweh's people. He takes his vengeance upon her, and though she trusts in spells and sorcery, that isn't much help. We learn in verse 10 that the wisdom and knowledge which Babylon had relied upon led them astray, which brought ruin and disaster, similar to the divine figure who was thrown down from heaven for corrupt wisdom in Ezekiel 28. The Babylonians consulted astrologers and stargazers who gave prophecy at each new moon, and wizards who served them with spells, trusting in their own powers and idols instead of trusting in Yahweh, the same crime that brought destruction to the Israelites. And just as the Israelites, they can't deliver themselves. The first half of Deutero-Isaiah concludes with chapter 48, which addresses all the topics previously discussed, such as Cyrus being the chosen one, the heavenly court, the predictions which have come to pass, Yahweh's polemic against idols, and his plans for the future of Judah. And this last one is important, as it seems that the Jews may have been a reference specifically to those who were living in Babylon and were then settled in Judah by the Persians, and not all of the people living in Judah. Israel then invokes Yahweh Sabaoth, but does so without sincerity because the people are stubborn. Then Yahweh speaks to an unknown figure, probably the servant discussed earlier, that he now announces new things which had been hidden from him, things never before seen or heard. Like the servant, this unidentified person has been named while still in the womb. His people have been tested in the furnace, a reference to their time in Babylon, but also to their belief that Yahweh's priests had to endure a painful ordeal to purify them, such as Isaiah's baptism by fire in the beginning of the book, or Malachi 3, when Yahweh's messenger will come to purify by fire, and only the worthy will endure. Or perhaps their endurance is what makes them worthy. Verses 9 to 11 refer back to the atonement. The people have earned their punishment, but Yahweh restrains his anger and instead redeems the nations and makes them pure once more. He is the creator of heaven and earth, and he holds out his hand to summon the heavenly figures to answer his call. He then says, "Let them all assemble and hear," possibly addressing the other gods which must now be rejected. They have been summoned to learn about a person whom Yahweh loves, presumably Cyrus, as he shall work against Babylon according to Yahweh's will. He's been summoned to do this, and indeed he is successful. Later in the Targum of Isaiah, this person will be changed to Abraham, who is said to have destroyed the idols of the Chaldeans inside the city of Ur before embarking on his mission to claim Canaan as his own. This will be especially useful in the foundation of the Abraham story in light of verse 19, which promises the descendants will be as numerous as the sand, a promise similar to that which will be made to Abraham in Genesis, and verse 20, where the people are commanded to begin their journey from Chaldea, just as Abraham will do. And we will see another inspiration for the Moses story in verse 21, when we're told that the people didn't thirst during their march through the wilderness, as water was made to flow from rocks. See Numbers chapter 20. The next part of Deutero-Isaiah is the community response. It deals with such themes as the restoration of Zion, salvation, their trust in Yahweh, and celebration in light of their new situation. Chapter 49 has Yahweh, the Redeemer of Israel, declaring that the rulers of the world will recognize his servant, similar to the Son of Man in 1 Enoch 62:7. Kings and princes shall bow down before him because he was chosen by Yahweh. He is a covenant to the people, though the words used here could have meant eternal covenant, and this is to cleanse the land, which is part of Yahweh's allotted heritage, as we saw in Deuteronomy 32:8. All the people are called back to Zion, from as far to the east as Babylon and as far to the west as Syene, Egypt, which is the Jewish community of Elephantine. In verse 14, Zion is presented as a woman who was abandoned by her husband, Yahweh, but was then reunited with him. We get a glimpse of this ancient female deity in a parallel scene in Micah 4:10. Writhe in agony, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you must leave the city to camp in the open field. You will go to Babylon, where you will be rescued. There Yahweh will redeem you out of the hands of your enemies. She appears again in Micah 5:3 when she gives birth to the shepherd, who gathers up the scattered flock of Israel to lead the return to Jerusalem. We saw her before in the Emmanuel prophecy of Isaiah 7 as the divine virgin who gives birth to a son. Worship of this goddess continued into the Second Temple period, but eventually she was lost. This was the Queen of Heaven and Lady Wisdom, who we discussed in episode 77. It seems that this female goddess is gradually becoming merely the personification of the city of Jerusalem, as the Israelites drift toward monotheism. The exiles return to her as she, that is, the city, not the goddess, is restored. The city will become too small for all of the people inhabiting it, and she will become like a great mother again. These bits, referring to Zion as a goddess, appear several more times throughout the remainder of Deutero-Isaiah. In 51:17-23, she appears as a woman drunk with grief over the loss of her children who were destroyed by her husband Yahweh. At the end of this section, he withdraws his wrath from them. And in the first two verses of chapter 52, she is awakened and dressed in glorious garments, and the unclean and uncircumcised are banished from her presence as she is enthroned. In the opening verses of chapter 54, she's a barren woman who is called to rejoice in jubilant song at the prospect of countless children, a sentiment which shall be seen again in the story of Sarah. And later in that chapter, she is dressed like a resplendent queen, a scene which is echoed in Revelation 21:10-14. Chapter 50 opens with Yahweh referring to Jerusalem as his wife and queen, whom he has not divorced or sold into slavery, though he has set her aside because of her unruly children who misbehaved. Picking up the thread in verse 10, we'll cover 4-9 later, we're encouraged to fear Yahweh and heed the voice of his servant, even in darkness. In their most desperate time, they should still trust in him, but those who instead trust in their own light will be punished. This is another version of trusting in Yahweh instead of your own wisdom. Chapter 51 begins by abruptly mentioning Abraham and Sarah and informing the audience that they are the father and mother of the Israelites. Here, the idea of Abraham as the progenitor of the exiles and Sarah as the new mother in place of daughter Zion is explicitly stated. Remember that the story of Abraham begins by stating that he came from this region during this exact same time period. Also, it should be mentioned that this is the only reference to Sarah outside of the story of Genesis. Zion is again personified as a woman in verse 3 and will be made like Eden, a thriving and joyous garden. The servant, appearing as a teacher, speaks in verses 4-8. He shall give teaching to the nations and serve as a light, and in his arms the coastlands shall find hope. Remember that the coastlands may refer to a group of foreign gods. Remember that in Enoch some of the fallen angels eventually found redemption. See episode 51. The heavens and earth are both destroyed, but his salvation endures forever, while the wicked are devoured. Beginning in verse 9, we see a recollection of the ancient creation by combat myth in which Yahweh must arise after a battle with the great chaos dragon Rahab, the same dragon Baal defeated. His victory over the water dragon is symbolic of the drying up of the waters to allow the dry land to emerge in Genesis 1, and it's this scene that is used to symbolize the path of salvation for the redeemed. This passage of the exiles through the sea on dry land will later be seen in the Exodus story when Moses leads the people through the Sea of Reeds to escape Egypt. Finally, we're told in the closing verses of the chapter that those who recognize the power of Yahweh as creator of the world have nothing to fear, as they shall neither die nor starve, because they're protected by their patron God. Yahweh states that Israel was sold to Babylon for nothing, and without payment they are redeemed. Assyria and Egypt were both punished for their treatment of Israel. Their rulers mocked and reviled in order to make Yahweh known to the people. Remember in the Exodus story, making Yahweh's greatness known was the reason given for sending the plagues against Egypt. A messianic messenger appears in verse 7, bringing the good news over the mountains and announcing peace and salvation to Zion, proclaiming Yahweh as their king. This verse will later be used by the Qumran community to describe Melchizedek, the royal high priest who will bring the final day of atonement at the end of the 10th Jubilee. The temple servants leaving Babylon are to purify themselves before leaving the city to carry back the sacred vessels and instruments that had previously been looted from Jerusalem. This scene was mentioned in Ezra chapter 1. The remainder of chapter 52 and all of 53 concerns the servant songs, which we'll cover shortly. And we've already covered most of chapter 54 when discussing Zion the goddess, though there are a few verses remaining, those being verses 7 to 10. In those, Yahweh states that in his wrath he abandoned the people but will tenderly welcome them back. His actions now, the covenant with the people, is like the days of Noah, when he punished the world with a flood and then swore to never again bring such destruction to the earth. This links the redemption of Judah with the eternal covenant concerning the remission of sins and the renewal of the earth. Finally, in chapter 55, we have Yahweh's invitation to grace, which resembles that of Proverbs 9:5, when Lady Wisdom invites us to her table. In both, the reward is life. Yahweh follows this up by promising to make with them an everlasting covenant, which he promised to David. This is interesting as much of the post-exilic material mentions a covenant with Abraham, in which Yahweh promises to continue. Yet here, it seems as if the original was with David and continues with the people who are leaving the land of the Chaldeans. This is also the democratization of the royal cult in the absence of a divine king. Where a king once bridged the gap between heaven and earth, soon the individual will be invited to bridge that gap themselves through communal meals and baptisms. But that's a topic for another episode. What's important now is the understanding that the covenant between king and patron deity is now a covenant between patron deity and the community. This is reinforced in verse 6, when the people are told to seek Yahweh and he may be found, and even the wicked may turn to him for forgiveness. But this new message in Deutero-Isaiah may seem strange to the people, so they're told that Yahweh's ways are not their ways. His ways are strange because his thoughts are higher than theirs. But his word shall bring new fertility and joy to the earth. The chapter and this section of Isaiah ends by repeating the lines found in the beginning, in chapter 40, verses 6 through 8, affirming that Yahweh's plans for renewal shall be an everlasting sign, thus bookending the work with a summary of the message. Now let's get into those servant songs which were inserted later during the time of Trito-Isaiah, beginning with 42, 1 through 7. The servant is referred to in the singular, but sometimes represents the entirety of the people in exile, so it may be appropriate to see him as a replacement for the royal high priest or the divine king. Yahweh makes his covenant with the people venturing from Babylon through his servant, just as he makes his covenant with Abraham, who is likewise called his servant, in Genesis 26:24. In this light, Abraham may be a fictional figure inserted into their history at the time of these writings to give an ancient pedigree to this concept. The servant is Yahweh's chosen, and upon him is placed the Spirit of God. His mission is gentle, not to shout or be heard in the street, to be bruised but not to break. He is a wick that is dimly lit but not extinguished. This is temple imagery, referring to the branches of the lampstands seen in Exodus 25:32, which was a symbol of the king. Faithfully he establishes justice upon the earth and the coastlands, those evil spirits which we mentioned earlier, and they will wait for his teaching. The idea of the servant being bruised but not broken suggests a comparison is being made between this servant figure and the Jewish people who suffered through the exile but emerged faithful to Yahweh, giving us a further democratization of the royal high priest. Psalm 134 tells us the original servants were the priests, but now it seems that this is being transferred onto the populace. And it should also be noted that these 4 verses are modeled after the coronation rites of the Jerusalem kings, where they are given the Spirit of Yahweh to bring justice to the nation. See the Psalms episodes for more info on the royal psalms and their uses. We could also find inspiration for this servant who suffered under Yahweh only to be redeemed and blessed, and under him the people are delivered, if we turn back to the books of Kings and Isaiah 38, which we covered in the previous episode. Hezekiah had sinned against Yahweh and was twice punished, first with a terminal disease and also with the Assyrian invasion. When he turned back to Yahweh, he was cured of the disease. His life extended, and the disease was sent as a curse against the Assyrians. We can see the parallels to the Jewish people quite easily as they turn against Yahweh. A foreign army was raised against them, and they suffered for it. Then their hearts returned to the deity. They were forgiven, set free, and sent back to a peaceful Jerusalem, while their oppressors were stricken with defeat. In Mark's Gospel, when Jesus is baptized and we read, "You are my Son, the Beloved, with you I am well pleased," it's a paraphrase of Isaiah 42:1. Finally, this is the only servant song that's found in the chapters discussing Cyrus, and parts of the song, such as leading the servant by the hand and releasing the prisoners, seems to have been borrowed from the Cyrus cylinder. He took under his hand Cyrus, king of the city of Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for the kingship over all of everything. As for the population of Babylon, who, as if without divine intention, had endured a yoke not decreed for them, I soothed their weariness, I freed them from their bonds. Actually, if you read the full inscription of the Cyrus cylinder, it will remind you a great deal of this section of Isaiah. The second servant song is found in chapter 49, beginning with verse 1 and extending to either verse 6 or verse 12, depending on which scholar you listen to. The servant is our speaker here, addressing those evil beings that often get translated as the coastlands that we covered in chapter 41, though they could also represent foreign nations which are hostile to Israel, or perhaps both. The servant was called by Yahweh before his birth and given a name while still in the womb. His mouth was made sharp like a sword, a detail which will be used for Jesus in Revelation. He was chosen as the servant at birth, but kept hidden away, just as was the case for the later Messiah. In verse 3, the servant is called Israel, but in later verses, Israel is used to refer to the people, not the servant figure. So the name Israel in verse 3 may be a later addition or a scribal error, though Philo of Alexandria understood it to mean the man who sees God. So its use in verse 3 could have a different meaning from verses 5 to 7. And personally, this explanation makes more sense to me, as both Moses and our servant saw the face of God. See Numbers 12:8 and Isaiah 53:11. Our servant is exhausted from toiling in vain, but he is right with Yahweh. This is a possible reference to Psalm 73. He is honored in the sight of Yahweh and raises up the tribes of Israel to restore the survivors and is a light to the nations. Continuing on to verse 12, Yahweh forms the servant as a covenant for the people on the day of salvation. They shall not hunger or thirst or be stricken by the sun and scorching wind, as they traverse the wilderness on their return. Mountains are turned into roadways as they are gathered in. Another point of note is how much of this short section is paralleled in Enoch. I could list all of the parallels, but we would be here for a while, so instead I'll just list those from chapter 48 of 1st Enoch. Verse 2 of Isaiah 49 can be compared to 1 Enoch 48:6. Verse 6 is paralleled by 1 Enoch 48:4. Verse 7 is paralleled by 1 Enoch 48:8. And finally, verse 10 parallels 1 Enoch 48:1. Our third servant song is found in chapter 50, verses 4 through 9. Yahweh has inspired him to speak and opens his ears to hear, as opposed to those who have ears but do not hear. See the first Isaiah episode. We can also point out that the divine king was given the words from Yahweh and inspired to speak, as we find in 2 Samuel 23:2 and Psalm 2:7. The servant is beaten about the back and face and is insulted and spat upon. You may be thinking of the Jesus story, but this goes back to ancient Mesopotamian kingship rites, wherein the king was degraded and struck before the god Bel. His royal garb was later restored to him as he was reinstated as king. This was accompanied by a purification of the temple and the sacrifice of a ram, all linked with the renewal of nature and prosperity of the nation. This is similar to the Day of Atonement, when the temple is purified and the sins are borne away on the scapegoat. The suffering servant was linked with the atonement ritual in Barnabas 7. And finally, we reach the last song, which begins in Isaiah 52:13 and runs to the end of chapter 53. It will also become the most important for the early Christians. The servant becomes wise and is exalted, lifted up like Yahweh. Verse 14 may seem odd in your Bibles. It probably reads, "Even as many were amazed at him, so marred were his features, beyond that of mortals was his appearance, beyond that of human beings." Why would amazing features beyond that of mere mortals be described as marred? It's because of a textual corruption. Our oldest copy, the Isaiah scroll, has a slightly different word, which means, "I have anointed him." So it should read, "Even as many were amazed at him, I have anointed him beyond that of mortals. His appearance is beyond that of humans." So he wasn't unrecognizable because of some disfigurement, but because he had been transformed, similar to the transformation endured by Enoch in 2 Enoch 22-24, or Moses when he comes down from the mountain. He then startles the nations, causing kings to stand speechless. He has no majesty to attract our attention, and he knew suffering and pain, but it was the pain of the people that he endured. So the suffering servant is serving as the scapegoat and sin bearer. He was pierced for the sins, and bearing their punishment made them whole, and through his wounds they were healed, as Yahweh laid the guilt of the people upon him. This is the ancient blood rites practiced in the temples for the expiation of sins. Like a lamb to the slaughter, he was seized and condemned and given to the grave, though he had done no wrong. For it was Yahweh's will to make his life a reparation offering, and he shall lengthen his days, just as we saw with the Son of Man in 1 Enoch 71:17. He shall see the light and be filled with knowledge. Because he bore their sins, he will receive a portion from among the many, just as Yahweh was awarded the nation of Israel as his portion from among the many gods in Deuteronomy 32:8. Our servant may have originally been the high priest on the Day of Atonement, offering blood to cleanse the nation and heal the land, bringing judgment and salvation, though we can't rule out the possibility that this poem was originally composed about Hezekiah's illness and recovery. And of course, it could also have older and deeper roots concerning the dying and rising god Baal to renew the land of Canaan. And we certainly have to consider the possibility that the story was used in all three cases, as such stories are often repurposed over the centuries. Regardless of its origin, the poem was powerful and important to the Jewish people, especially those who felt downtrodden, such as those who wrote the Enochic material. This servant permeates those writings, seen with various titles such as Anointed One, Chosen One, and Righteous One, who has the Spirit, establishes justice, is the light of the people, is hidden away, and the kings of the nations are humbled before him. Most of that can be found in 1 Enoch 46-50, though other parts can be found in chapters 38, 39, 40, 41, 45, 55, and 62 of 1 Enoch. Though the servants' songs will get their most use with the writings of the New Testament documents, appearing a dozen times in the Christian canon, including all 4 canonical Gospels and the book of Acts, Isaiah inspired more verses in the New Testament than any other book in the Hebrew Bible, and possibly it inspired some of the Hebrew Bible as well. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, or get information on the latest episode. And as always, thank you for listening.